Oh yay, oh yay, oh yay, oh yay, oh yay.
Willkommen, bienvenue, welcome. No, this is not cabaret, it's Think About It, a podcast about the power of ideas and how language can change the world, with Uli Baer. Does social justice and moral progress depend on free speech? Today I will be speaking with Professor Akeel Bilgrami of Columbia University. He's a philosopher and the author of many books, was the chair of the philosophy department at Columbia and the director of its Humanities Institute, and has two different interests, really, philosophy of mind and language and political philosophy and moral psychology. Professor Bilgrami will join me to talk about the value of free speech in making society better. I want to welcome my guest today, Professor Akeel Bilgrami, who is the Sidney Morgan Besser Chair of Philosophy at Columbia. Thank you, Akeel, for joining the podcast today. I wanted to ask you a couple things about the free speech controversies on campus, and in particular, I'm interested in two aspects. I'm interested in your effort to explain the philosophical underpinnings of this pervasive idea of the marketplace of ideas, or the kind of trade in ideas, and then to move to another aspect of these controversies, which is the generational difference between the perceptions of speech. If we could start maybe by sort of opening up this conversation that there's an idea that the university should be a marketplace of ideas, that all ideas should be allowed, that the whole point is to pursue the truth by engaging with any and all available thoughts and ideas, and that this is rooted in John Stuart Mill and then Joseph Holmes' idea of a free marketplace.
Right. Well, the ideal of free speech has been sort of located in that metaphor of the marketplace of ideas, and that does go back to a celebrated, famous argument of Mill's. And I think that argument is actually just a grotesque fallacy, and I myself don't think that metaphor of the marketplace of ideas really is the source of the best justification for free speech, whether on campus or in the mondiality of the world at large. But I do think that, and we can talk about the metaphor, but on campuses today, I think it is a really interesting phenomenon. And I think it's really sort of a brand new phenomenon in the last 5 years or so, where questions of diversity and difference, cultural difference and racial difference and gender difference, have generated a new questioning of the basic value of free speech. And that's an important thing to get straight on, because I think there is something quite novel that's emerging on campuses. I don't think it's the same thing that it's the same issue of free speech, for instance, that Galileo encountered in Renaissance Europe. Here's why I think it's a new phenomenon. You see, I think things trace back to the very creative turmoil of the 1960s. I think one has to situate current controversies on campus. By current, I really mean only the last few years, 3, 4, 5 years, where there's real hostility that's emerged over the question of free speech. And I think cool heads have gone missing on both sides.
On both sides, right? There's a lot of acrimony and a lot of acrimony. There seems to be a real incommensurate way that people think either, and there's a way of setting it up, either you're a free speech absolutist or you are absolutely against free speech.
That's right. But I think one needs to come to some grips with the pedigree of current controversy, and that really goes back to the 1960s, when the youth were, really protesting initially the misadventures of this country's government in Southeast Asia, and there was the whole draft of young people in conscription, and that protest really derived from or associated with a left politics that wasn't just about the Vietnam War, but really was about a critique of capitalism and so on, and imperialism. Capitalism's
So you're linking this protest of the war to a larger critique of the kind of...
Right. So I'm saying the issues go back to that. But what's interesting about that period is that questions of say, racial diversity and difference emerged at the same time as this left critique of American government policy in Southeast Asia as deriving from a critique of capitalism and imperialism. Now, when racial politics emerged in tandem with a left politics of that kind, it was a racial politics that was basically arguing for the political rights, civil rights, of a whole race of African Americans, of blacks.
So it's a fight for equality.
For equality.
And it's a larger fight for kind of justice in a system that isn't set up to probably allow for this kind of equality. So you have this protest against the war as a critique of the American setup of society at large.
Right. And the racial issues were in tandem. They came along with a left critique of society and economics and political economy and so on. And so it was very much a political set of claims on the question of race, civil rights, and one of the most remarkable pieces of legislation in American history emerged out of those struggles.
So the Civil Rights Act of 1965, which is for the first time establishes equality in all sorts of institutional settings, workplaces, accommodation, transportation, etc. So we have a moment when there's equality established socially. Yes.
Right. Now, what's interesting is that when racial politics divorced from a left critique of capital, of imperialism, and so on, in the decades that followed, basically from the 80s on, it was no longer just a political struggle for economic and civil rights, but it became really the focus changed to culture and identity, right? And that was a very marked shift because it wasn't tied. Racial politics was no longer tied to a critique of capital, but it was just a cultural critique. And so
Can we stay with this for a moment? Let's say in the 60s we have a kind of demand for racial justice, for political and legal equality. The same for gender, for political and legal equality. So you have
in the
kind
70s,
of equality. So this is the late 60s, early 70s. And then this becomes, there's also a kind of parallel movement of a kind of politics of pride and a politics of identity, to affirm and claim one's space in society, not just legally and politically, but also culturally and visibly.
Exactly. So when racial politics and gender politics, feminist politics, got divorced from critique of capital and became a cultural theme instead, then it emerged as a real valorization of the very idea of identity, racial identity, gender identity, and so on. And so a quite different kind of politics emerged. It was no longer just a political, but a cultural set of themes, and that's when identity politics emerged. The very idea of difference became a cultural object of study.
Do you have a sense of why did this kind of cleavage happen, or this kind of separation of a political demand for critique of capitalism and becomes a politics of representation and becomes sort of shifting into what you're saying is identity politics?
Well, I think that there was a receding of left politics. And this, I'm talking about these developments, these culturalist developments in the study of race and gender really emerged only in the 80s onwards, right? Before that, it was really working side by side with left politics, and it was really a purely political and economic struggle for race, on the question of race. Now, in the 80s, I think, there were an enormous number of changes in the international political economy. So, for instance, the Bretton Woods institutions were dismantled or remantled, really. And as a result, the very nature of capital changed. The industrial capital really gave way to the domination of finance capital. And there was this tremendous mobility of capital generated by these changes.
Like what we call kind of globalization, or your colleague Gayatri Spivak said the only thing that was globalized is money and data. So money is globalized in a new way at this moment.
Yeah, it's finance, really, and that dominated capital from the 80s on, thanks to these changes that I mentioned. And as a result, I think, left politics just was beaten down. So trade unions...
And in this country, exactly. The unions, so in some ways...
Exactly.
The unions are dismantled in a way, sort of slowly or systematically, and so what happens is a shift away from industrial money to finance, and the unions are disappearing as a major
for a very
force.
For a very simple reason, that if you have labor troubles in a country, and you have political parties with manifestos and platforms, pro-labor and pro-working people platforms, that the capital just flies out of the country.
When there are other countries to go to, and there are other countries that are suddenly available that you can move industrial money and production into other countries.
Right. Well, if it's mostly financial capital, it moves at the press of a button. Right. So as a result, because of the anxieties of capital flight, these societies, and pretty much all over the globe, right, are forced to cut down on the progressive platforms. And trade unions are beaten down by that. Labor gets casualized, impermanent, and it loses its bargaining power. So, but anyway, as a result of this, left politics just recedes. And so the left becomes associated with identity politics.
And so can you say a little bit about what you mean by that? Because that word has become such a kind of term of disagreement itself.
So it's basically a culturalist shift. So identity is no more a racist struggle to achieve economic equality, but it is to insist that there is a cultural inferiorization of whole races, of a whole gender, and all of that is true. And I think one of the most interesting things that emerged on campuses is how the centrality of class as a concept was dethroned. So the left has always emphasized class identity over other identities.
Right.
And they've in fact thought all other identities, whether race or gender, just parochialize politics. And the chief identity should be class identity. That's always been the traditional left's view of things. And in many ways that's wrong, because after all, there are many other sources of disrespect than material inequalities. Race, caste in the country I come from, that's India, and gender and so on are all locations by which one half of a population, in the case of gender, has contempt for, or if not contempt, there's just a whole set of patriarchal institutions.
Right. And formal and informal inequality. Economic inequality, political inequality, cultural inequality.
Right. So there's sources of disrespect, contempt, and so on, which are not just material.
Right. They shift from an economic to a cultural or political
space. Well,
they
always existed, right? They always existed. Material inequalities are not the only source of disrespect. Class disrespect is not the only disrespect.
Right.
There's racial disrespect, caste disrespect, and that was always there. It's just that the left focused on one kind of identity, which is class.
Can add one thing to the universities. What's interesting in American universities, if you reach back sort of 30 more years, in the late 40s and 50s here, through the GI Bill, a huge influx of really people from different classes into the universities. There's a kind of increase of people who didn't go to universities, a big kind of massive program, essentially affirmative action for basically people from lower classes to attend higher education. And then in the 60s, you have women, and especially African American or minority students, entering the universities. You have this big shift. So in some ways, what you're saying, they're describing the left's detachment from class issues and attachment to cultural issues, is also that the universities did make a huge leap forward to bring more people into the universities. It's no longer such an elite institution by the 60s. And then they're adding women and minorities in large numbers. Of course, there were a few, but they're really in large numbers. So then we're in the 80s, and you're now having sort of the left politics saying identity is rooted maybe in cultural identity, ethnic identity, gender identity, and that is a political argument to be made at the expense of previously the more kind of material inequality argument.
Right, because the left just was beaten down by the changes in political economy all over the globe. And see, my sense here is that the left was wrong not to recognize these other forms of disrespect that come not from material inequalities, but from race, gender, and caste, and so on. But there is, however, something that is correct about what the left's view was, that despite being wrong in this respect, I think the left was right in the following sense. Ask yourself this question. Suppose we take the good things, the ameliorations on the front of race and gender that have emerged since the 1980s. Right? The real gains have been made on racial and gender equality. Now ask yourself the question, would these gains on race and gender have been allowed if they really threatened capital? If they really threatened the complete stronghold influence of corporations in this society? Would these changes in, these improvements, these ameliorations on the race and gender front have been allowed if they really undermine capital and the influence of corporations?
So your question is whether
I don't think they would have been
the left allowed itself to be attached to questions that are not fundamentally calling into question the kind of the capitalist
Right.
order.
And so it's only because
nonetheless, they're real advances, as you say.
Yeah.
They're real steps
Exactly.
forward, and so they actually do benefit people materially
Exactly.
and culturally.
They
and
do
politically.
benefit them. They give them both cultural pride and their ameliorations. But I do think the left had this much right. I mean, they were wrong to not recognize other forms of disrespect, but they had this much right that these other things would not have been allowed. These improvements would not have been allowed if they undermined capital. And that's just a kind of indirect proof that class is more fundamental.
Leaves open probably the question of the astonishing success of the civil rights movement in this country, that it was actually achieved, that actually, because it wouldn't have really been allowed if we used a purely sort of, is it
that's what
protecting the
I
caste?
think
So
the
yes.
answer is it would never have been allowed.
So the
Right.
radicality of that is actually that something happened that really wouldn't have been allowed if the
That's
capitalist order just protected
That's
it. Some hope there. saying.
That makes the class issue more fundamental in a way. Now, just to be fair, I think you can pose the converse question too. You can ask the question, would improvement on the class front would been allowed if it undermined patriarchy, say?
As a cultural hegemony, you're saying patriarchy
Right.
now.
So would improvements in class inequality, would the creation of greater class equality have been allowed if it undermined patriarchy? You can ask that question. But you see, I don't know how to go about answering that question, partly because there haven't been improvement in class.
There's greater economic inequality. We've seen that actually.
Exactly.
As
If
the rise in
Piketty is right, it's actually increased. So,
Yes.
so since it's not happened, it's very hard to answer that question.
right.
You know,
What I
whereas
like-
there have been improvements on class and on gender and race issues.
So what you're opening up is also that the term equality carries at least two meanings. There's pure economic equality.
Yeah.
And so Piketty, for example, is saying there's larger inequality in purely economic terms.
Right.
But there may be gains in cultural or political or legal equality.
Right.
And I think if we go back to you sort of where we are right now in the 80s, what's happening in the university. So the left gives up on a kind of class-based kind of leftist politics, let's say for the sake of a different politics that you're saying also makes some advances. But something shifts here into the area
Right.
that you're calling identity politics.
In the 80s and 90s, it really reached its peak in the 90s. Identity politics really triumphed on campuses. I mean, it really caught fire on campuses. And what is interesting is that it was led by the faculty. It was not the students. See, the students were active in the 60s and early 70s, but they were not active in this transformation on campuses in the 80s and 90s. This kind of, the so-called culture wars, where the old guard said, I can't teach English without having to talk about gender and race and so on, right? And these culture wars were really culture wars between faculty members.
But also probably two generations of faculty. A
Yeah.
kind of older generation that said we are destroying the Western canon and Western civilization.
right.
And you had smart arguments, Alan Bloom, and you had less smart arguments, people saying this is the end of Western civilization, and other people said Western civilization has been set up to exclude other perspectives. It is
Right.
not inclusive enough, so we're going to challenge that.
Right.
So I lived through that. I went to college then, and you're right. It was faculty debates.
Yeah, so they were
And
mostly faculty-led.
Spilling over into the public with the kind of obscenity debates about Mapplethorpe and people like that, the kind of Jesse Helms sort of policing of obscenity. And so there was a cultural component, I think, that was even off campus,
Yeah.
early 90s debates, the cultural wars.
Right. It was outside campuses too, but it did really have a major transformation, and some of it had very good results, by the way. I mean, as a result of feminism of this kind on campuses, I think a lot of sexism on campus was forced out. Faculty just behaved very differently after feminism on campuses, both towards students and towards each other. And so there were a lot of good things that came out of it. And I think that the people today who are really attacking the politics of difference and diversity are they have no sensitivity to how people feel as a result of centuries of oppression, whether it's women or blacks. And there's something really obtuse about a lot of people who are just completely unsympathetic to what has been actually achieved, the good things that have been achieved through the triumph of identity politics on campuses.
If we stay there for a little bit, I think it's interesting. I share the sentiment that there's a kind of unwillingness to listen to this next generation. And it's interesting, these generational conflicts seem to be repeated, but they're different.
Well, but that's the thing. You see, though faculty started this, the current controversies are really led by the students. And the faculty, by and large, fall on the anti-students' side. I mean, there's some faculty, of course. I mean, since they started it in the 80s and 90s, there's some who still continue with it. But I think by and large, you're quite right to point out that it's a generational dispute.
And could you say a little bit about what the two sides of this dispute are? Because we need some clarity on those terms of diversity and difference versus this free speech doctrine, which is, I think, a little bit doctrinaire since it is so absolute.
Right. So the current controversies, the faculty are no longer on the side of identity, by and large. I mean, there are exceptions. And the students are, by and large, insisting that because of centuries of oppression of African Americans and women, certain things simply have to be changed on campuses. And so they are expressing sensitivities to what goes unacknowledged. One of the most interesting claims is that any kind of speech that is hostile, which comes under the rubric of what is called hate speech, must be stigmatized and sanctioned. There must be sanctions against it. And in fact, the sensitivities are so acute that even civil speech, or seemingly civil speech, has a sort of hidden underbelly of hostility, which are known as microaggressions. That's a new term to describe the hostilities that may even lie below the surface of seemingly civil speech. So it's not just hate speech, but microaggressions at the submerged level, and that these things ought to be acknowledged and sanctioned. That's one set of demands by the young. Second, there's a demand that there is so much legacy of the hostility of race and gender, for instance, that women and minorities generally need a sort of safe space to not feel the weight, the oppressive weight of majoritarianism.
We can stay for this for a moment. I think this last point. I think students are also saying let's say we've been here since the 60s. Women were admitted, African American students were admitted, minority students were admitted. Our parents have gone here. Our parents had to exercise the politics of respectability, do twice as well to achieve half as much, work really hard. They then became professionals, and they sent their children to the same schools, and their children are there. This is the third generation, and they're sitting here in the 2000 teens and saying, and we are still being asked every single day whether we really belong, whether we have a right to be here. And what they have termed microaggressions, I think, is actually, in another way one could say, is this a form of serial systematic harassment? And we've had too many episodes recently in this country where people are not just asked to leave certain spaces, but police are called when they are getting a coffee or being in a park or being in a dorm room. So I think there's links to a different kind of social movement, which is Black Lives Matter, and saying this country's institutions have really not protected equality. So I think what's hard about this is that students are young and driven by passion and saying all sorts of things, and they're saying we are offended, we're in distress. But I actually think it touches on a question whether the university has truly been committed to assuring the equality of all of its students and faculty.
That's right.
And there's
demanding.
Something is worth listening to, I felt.
Sure. I mean, the sensitivity, a third demand, apart from the sanctioning of hate and speech and microaggressions and the demand for safe spaces, a third very crucial demand is that things that are taught in classrooms, if there's material which is, hurtful or alarming to say blacks or women, just depictions of lynchings or rape and so on, or slave beatings and so on, as literature often depicts, then students must be warned that this is about to happen in a classroom. They can have the right to not have it sort of articulated in these ways, and they can stay away from class and so on. So there's this enormous range of sensitivities that identity politics has thrown up among students now. And faculty have retreated. Many faculty, having started this identity politics, have retreated. And so it has become, roughly speaking, a generational dispute, despite some students being on the other side and some faculty being on. Now, what is interesting to me is, first of all, that there are two sociological points that have to be made here. I'll say something about philosophically too, but let me observe two sociological points which are pretty obvious but still worth registering explicitly. One is, you see, people of my generation, so I'm in my 60s, I was a very young student in the late 60s. We were brought up in the shadow of McCarthyism.
Okay.
Right? And the shadow of the Cold War.
In the Cold War. Very much in the heart of the Cold War. Severe repression of political speech by the government.
Right. Yeah. So we are attuned by our experiences to place free speech as very central, because we really do have a sense of how oppressive McCarthyism was, how oppressive the Cold War was. How you couldn't be a leftist without being stigmatized and, in fact, being surveyed and so on and so forth.
And you lose your job or be actually jailed and really punished. Yeah.
Right. So the whole Cold War period and the sort of legacy of McCarthyism, which was much subtler, even after McCarthyism faded, is something that makes, for the older generations, that makes free speech very central for us. Students have not grown up in the shadow of McCarthyism and in the Cold War. For them, it's identity politics which has shaped them. So they don't feel free speech is as central as these sources of disrespect in race and gender. But what is even more important is that their social orbit is almost entirely electronic, right? And they participate on the internet or in the internet with far greater relish and ease than the older generation does. And it's really the whole social orbit is electronic. It's the internet. And the internet has anonymous interlocutors. So there are exchanges on the internet, and they're eavesdropping on exchanges. Young people are eavesdropping on exchanges which are extremely hostile, made by anonymous interlocutors, and they're full of hate speech. They're full of racist, and so they feel if there's so much racist and hate speech in their social orbits, electronic social orbits, they don't think of free speech as central. They think it should be censored.
So I want to stay with this. This is really important because I think you're absolutely right that the internet makes it possible to really be confronted with a huge amount of hate speech and idiotic speech.
Which is
and
anonymous,
falsehoods
so you can't trace the agent.
And I think this younger generation and other people are also saying, so this idea from the older generation that free speech has not only protected us politically on the left, but also assured the gradual march of reason and the triumph of the truth, and that somehow progress is assured. And they're saying, if this were true, how come I can go on the internet and see so much incredible hate speech about people like me all the time if your idea is right, that free speech just makes us all into better people, that kind of this idea of the increase of a tolerant society, kind of Lee Bollinger's really powerful idea. So I think they're saying, so you're telling me I should believe in free speech because it's really good for society and everybody, except that my group has been targeted and seems to be targeted more and more and more because of these free speech protections. So I think they have some doubt that this idea that free speech always benefits minorities and liberates everybody and brings us toward more equality may be an assumption, which of course can't be proven because we can't do experiments with society and prohibit speech.
They just deny it because they see, since their social life is really electronic and internet based, not face-to-face and not voice-to-voice telephonic, but really on the internet.
And the other thing, it's documented, so suddenly everybody can witness these things. So everybody witnesses suddenly what happens to minorities in this country because you watch videos. Every day there's a video of how people are treated. So I think the anonymity and the fact that everybody becomes a witness to this is very powerful, that they can point and say, look, this is what really happens when you walk into a room or you walk into a building.
Right. Well, but the young actually witnesses it more because they are on the internet the whole time, on Facebook and so on, whereas the older generation is much less on it. So as a result, it doesn't have the same compelling anxiety for the old because they don't witness it in the same way because they just don't participate. This is all of their social orbit is really electronic.
So how can the older generation, people who actually really thought free speech has to be protected because McCarthyism was really a kind of abuse of sort of the government's power, how can you convince people who are challenging this idea and saying, and how can you convince them of the inherent value of free speech? There's goodness, there's political value in it.
So that is the crucial question. Now, one of the things that you should notice, see, my view on this, and I've written about this in a recent paper which you might look at. It's in Ken Pruitt. I don't know if you know Ken Pruitt.
Yes.
He's the head of the Social Science Research Council. He's edited a special issue of Social Research, the journal Social Research, which is on scholarship at risk or something like that. And I've got a paper in there in which I argue that what the young are really arguing for, especially in the humanities, is to model humanistic inquiry on the model of inquiry in criminal law. Now, this might sound like a philosopher's artifice, but really, I really mean that. I really think this is a brand new development in the last 5 years. Here's what I mean. You see, why do I say that students want universities' inquiry, especially in the humanities, to be like inquiry in criminal law? What is inquiry in criminal law? Ask yourself. Well, ask the question, why is it that a juror in a criminal case is not given the instruction, keep an open mind, but is rather given the instruction, presume innocence on the part of the accused until the threshold of evidence is met beyond reasonable doubt. Presume innocence. You see, when you do inquiry, generally, Generally speaking, when you do inquiry, the general instruction to the inquirer is keep an open mind.
Don't presume anything, right?
Exactly.
And in a forensic or legal
Don't presume
investigation,
anything,
you have
keep
to
an open
presume
mind.
innocence. Yeah.
Why is the juror in criminal law told presume innocence on the part? It is because there are ongoing prejudices that the juror has to overcome. So one prejudice is, if somebody is accused, there must be something to it.
Right.
Where there's this
He must
cliche-
have done something.
Yeah, there's the cliche, where there's smoke, there's fire. Right. So one goes in with a prejudice as a juror, right? So you have to counter that prejudice, and so you're told to presume innocence rather than just keep an open mind. Okay. Another very serious prejudice is that, except in very few cases, the prosecution has the whole authority of the state.
Right.
Right. And so the accused is, so the jury is intimidated by the authority of the state. I mean, just think of the Milgram experiments,
Of course,
right?
of
How
course,
you really are
yeah.
susceptible to
Right.
the power of
And
authority
people
to
consent
intimidate.
to authority more
Right.
easily than we thought.
Right. So, and it's the prosecution, not the defense, which usually has authority. I mean, police brutality cases are an exception, but by and large, it's the state and the prosecution which has. So, to counter the prejudice of, that you might be intimidated by authority, you have to favor. So, basically, criminal law has a notion of due process, what can be said and what can't be said in court, how evidence is accumulated, how it is articulated, what can be struck from what
And
the witness
what's
says,
admissible, yeah, there's
what
real
is
criteria
admissible
of
and what is not,
admissible.
what must be struck from what.
If
the
it was
witness-
illegally obtained, it's not admissible.
Yeah, or if it just, if a witness says things which are,
Or
only
prejudicial.
some things are
right.
allowed and so on, right? Prejudicial. So to counter prejudice, you don't give the instruction, keep an open, you give the instruction.
So how has this become a model for students in the
And the
humanities?
students are saying there are centuries of prejudice that exist in society, including on campuses, against gender, and we must therefore have an analog to due process, what can be said in classrooms and what can't be said. So an analog to due process comes from the idea that you must counter prejudices that exist, right? So it really is like criminal law that they're
Interesting.
demanding inquiry to be.
So where do we take this? Isn't this a good moment to then sort of talk about this if the students have this assumption? Because other assumptions prevail of how a classroom operates and how we reach the truth, right? Which is not the forensic or the legal model.
Exactly. So, well, my idea here is that if I'm right that this is what the students are demanding, they haven't put it this way, but they're not philosophers. I mean, they don't articulate things in this very explicit way conceptually, but I do think they're demanding this implicitly. And if I'm right that this is what they're demanding, that there should be a form of due process of what can and can't be said in classrooms and so on, then I think that I would want to tell them, make a distinction, and say that even within criminal law, there are two models. So let it be the case that they're right, and I'm right to think of them as,
Like in a general sense, I would say let them say the rules of the game have to be defined in a way that they are fair and equitable, let's say. And we think they're not right now.
Exactly,
So they're just
because
saying
we're
we're going to
countering
change the
prejudice.
rules of the game, and the rules of the game, as we know, have been established by somebody. They didn't fall from the sky and are natural. They are
and
constructed.
they're expressive
so
of prejudices,
we
and we want to counter that, and so we want an analog to
Right.
due process.
And
But I want to now say that even if that is right, criminal law offers two different models within it. One is the forensic model, right, which is what happens in these courtrooms downtown, where you go
on Law and Order, those television
that kind of
dramas,
thing.
right?
Exactly. But there's also the cases of transitional justice, as you find, say, in South Africa, etc.
And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, are
Right.
kind of a different kind of.
So that's criminal law. You're assessing the crimes of apartheid regime, but it's not forensic, because you have to engage with the accused, right? Therefore, they're brought in, they confess, you you ask them about their motivations. And so it's what happens in forensic criminal law, is that the accused sits silently in the dark, and you just see him or her as the object of objective investigation, right? Forensic investigation.
So it's detached.
It's detached.
Exactly.
And in transitional cases, the accused speaks up.
So there's an engagement.
with-
So your differentiation is to say the one is a detachment, and that's problematic. And the other one is a kind of engagement.
And I think that universities must adopt the second, even if it's a criminal law model, if the obviously relevant criminal law model is the case of the transitional justice of the kind you had in South Africa. And there, if it's an engagement model of criminal law inquiry, then you have to listen, you have to listen to all sides.
To all sides, yeah.
And engagement requires listening to all sides. So even if the students are right to counter prejudice through this due process idea of inquiry in the humanities and so on, if it takes the engagement transitional model rather than the forensic model of criminal law, then you don't undermine free speech.
But you've written and pointed out that this engagement is reciprocal and has to happen on both sides.
On both sides.
And there cannot be a kind of blunt argument that free speech is absolute, we are the second order argument, and you should just listen to us, but rather the side of free speech has to also explain what is the value of this, rather than just assuming this is self-evident. And I think there's part of the engagement that's not happening because it's not mutual or happening on both sides.
Exactly. So I think the students don't get to say free speech comes second if there's engagement, but on the other, both sides have to engage. But that now, the notion of engagement is a very different argument for free speech than the marketplace of ideas stuff.
Interesting. Very different. It's not just a free-for-all.
Yeah, I mean, the marketplace of ideas thing is unconvincing for reasons that I've written about.
Right, yes, no. I think really importantly that you've actually pointed out that it is kind of misleading to assume. It's just it's based on the pure idea of rationality.
Right.
To just finish kind of on the extreme examples on campus are usually not necessarily in a classroom where someone's introducing a text, but they're really about kind of what are either called controversial speakers or really firebrands who are only there to provoke. And I think there's a gradation. There are some people who are there to provoke and some people there to just actually really instigate rage and strong feelings. And there I think, so what do students have to do to be told you have to listen to this? Because of course there are many rules of the game. We don't accept racial epithets. We don't accept slurs in classrooms. We don't allow for lots of speech.
No, but you see, I think there's a confusion when people think. But so if I'm right that the argument for free speech is not the marketplace metaphor, but the notion of engagement, one shouldn't insist that engagement means dialogue. You see, dialogue is just one kind of engagement. Now, I don't think you can engage with somebody who's coming and shouting and has no desire to hear you.
Or who's saying people like you should not exist in the university or on the planet.
Yeah. So they don't want to engage. They just come there to abuse and shout, right? And maybe there are speakers who want to do that. But the point is, you can't have a dialogue with somebody who does that. In fact, my view is you can't have a dialogue with anybody who's not your equal.
Equal meaning willing to engage in the terms of reasoned debate, or...
No, I just mean you can't have a dialogue with the master. If you're an oppressed person, right, a slave can't have
meaning in a political sense, not the master of a college.
No. I mean, just the privileged,
right,
or the. Okay. So I mean, a slave owner can't have a slave can't have a dialogue with the slave owner.
So the principle of equality, everybody's ideas matters equally in this context.
Well, so dialogue is not possible when there is real power relations, but not all engagement is dialogue. You see, suppose somebody just comes and rants, right? You don't have to have a dialogue with the person, but if the person is saying things, right, let them circulate, let what they say circulate, and speak to the ideas that are circulating in them, right? So engagement is a broader notion than dialogue. Maybe you can't have a dialogue with with such a person. But if the person is nevertheless allowed to speak, you can you can just take those ideas and make them the target of your criticism, make it a target of systematic criticism. So this counter that people say, well, how can I engage with somebody who rants? The point is, you can't have a dialogue with somebody who rants, but the larger notion of engagement still allows free speech. Let the view be aired so that you can then engage with the ideas, not the person.
And the point you brought up just a minute ago is that there's power involved. You're saying when someone has a certain kind of amount of power, that has to be taken into consideration. So I think the students are also saying the institution has to finally calibrate who they invite and who they give a certain kind of power or prestige for, and yet allow for another form of engagement. If you just bring somebody in for 1 hour, let them rant, and then they leave campus, that may not be the form of engagement, because then students are left to their own devices and say, we now have to meet in our own groups and talk. Versus there can be a structured form of allowing for engagement, that everybody has access to the forum of debate.
Well, the point is that they can have access to it not at the moment of the ranting, but later on, if the ideas are in circulation, they can engage with it. I'm against disinviting speakers I'm sort of, in that sense, fairly fundamentalist about free speech. But I think you have to give better arguments than the marketplace of ideas argument.
Interesting, which is mostly the argument used, that anybody should come, which is also not the reality of any university in this country. Yeah. Not everybody's invited. People are not invited for other reasons all the time, not because they're offensive, just because they're not qualified or they don't have anything relevant to say.
Yeah. I mean, I sometimes think it's foolish to invite somebody who's a right-wing, hostile, maniacal person. I mean, it's foolish because it just disturbs the peace and so on. But very often, somebody nevertheless wants it. I don't think it should be stopped. And certainly, I find these disinvitations just really very bad. I mean, I think they're very bad to invite somebody and disinvite them, because all it does is give publicity to the hostile views and give them a moral high ground. I don't think bad people should be given a moral high ground by being given the publicity of this kind. It's probably best to engage with them after the rant by letting the ideas emerge and then making a systematic critique of them. And after all, that is what happened in the criminal transitional cases, such as in South Africa.
Which are cases of engagement and not just of giving somebody a platform and adversarial kind of approach where one person speaks and then you're supposed to judge something.
Right. Well, exactly. Where the person is just sitting there and you just see them as an object of detached investigation. And I think that's not what universities are like. Engagement is essential to the humanities.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. We're on this note of engagement. I really appreciate Akeel for joining today in the podcast. And thanks, and have a great summer.
Thanks a lot.